First, it's intimidate. They will intimidate you by phone calls, by emails, by articles about you, criticizing you, and the objective is to shut you up. Put your head down under the wall and stop talking about Israel. If intimidation doesn't work, they move to the second level of their strategy, which is to isolate you. If they can't intimidate you, they will intimidate others to isolate you. So you'll be invited to speak at a conference. They'll target the conference organizers to have you disinvited. Your PhD has been accepted by the university. They'll target the university to have your PhD revoked. They can't isolate you. They go to the third level, which is incriminate. They'll try and use the law against you.
Dear friends, today it is my honor again to welcome Reverend Stephen Sizer. It wasn't long ago when we have had a conversation on the questions of Christian nationalism, Christian Zionism, dispensationalism, and how all of this is involved with the situation in Israel today and the Middle East and the war against Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank and beyond, we can say. But today we are going to go a step further. And we are going to specifically focus on the questions of anti-Semitism, what anti-Semitism is and what anti-Semitism is not. Let me tell you a little bit about Reverend Stephen Sizer again. He's a retired and well-known priest in the Church of England and a human rights activist known for his public condemnation of Christian Zionism. He's also the founder and director of Peacemaker Trust, a registered charity dedicated to peacemaking. His biography and his CV is a big one, with lots of details. We'll also provide a link to his website so that you can get informed more about the life and activities and ministry of Reverend Stephen Sizer. But let me just take a few details out of his CV, out of his biography. For example, Reverend Stephen Sizer chairs the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. He has been also speaker at a number of international events. He's also known for his public activism. He takes active parts in public marches for human rights, peace and ceasefire in Gaza, as well as taking speaking appointments in those marches and many other events. If you have not listened to our previous conversation, I would really like to encourage you to do so, and the link is provided. Today we are going to converse about very important subject. As I've already mentioned it's about anti-Semitism, what it is not, and how it's being misrepresented, abused, used, manipulated with. It seems almost that anything and everything goes under the umbrella of anti-Semitism. It reminds me of a cartoon or a caricature which I saw not long time ago, and I hope I'm going to remember it correctly, but the point is here. A man is trying to fix the engine of his car, and obviously it is not going well. He hates his car. So he says, I hate this car. I must be an anti-Semite. So Reverend Sizer, we are living in the days when it seems that almost everything and anything can be labeled as anti-Semitism if it represents any form of criticism of the state of Israel, its leadership and its actions towards predominantly Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. I've also seen and realized that people are being labeled that they're anti-Semites simply because they are empathizing with the Palestinian people, with the suffering of the Palestinian people. So it is very important that we distinguish today what it is, what anti-Semitism is, and what it is not. And I suggest, Dr. Sizer, that we start where I think we should be starting, And simply, I don't know, I'm conditionally saying that we define, if we can, anti-Semitism. What are its origins? And how do we recognize the real manifestations and expressions of anti-Semitism and distinguish them from those that are not? Dr. Stephen Sizer, you're welcome.
If we're trying to understand the origin of the term anti-Semitism, we go to the Community Security Trust, which is a Zionist organization. They explain that the word anti-Semitism came into use in the late 19th century to describe, in their words, pseudo-scientific racial discrimination against Jews. The context was the pogroms in Russia, the prejudice toward Jewish people in Eastern Europe, for example. But they go on to say, generally today, it describes all forms of discrimination, prejudice, and hostility toward Jews throughout history. So it came into use in the 19th century, along with the word Zionism, actually, which was coined in the late 19th century as well. You know, anti-Semitism is simply a form of racism. It's no different from Islamophobia. Anti-Semitism is generally understood as, quote, hostility to, prejudice, or discrimination against Jewish people. It's a form of racism, and we must repudiate it unequivocally. Anthony Lerman, who's a specialist in anti-Semitism, said this. He said, in a word, classical anti-Semitism is the discrimination against, denial of, or assault upon the rights of Jews to live as equal members of whatever society they inhabit. It's prejudice toward Jews because they are Jews. That's why it's a form of racism, and we must repudiate it unequivocally.
So anti-Semitism is a form of racism and form of nationalism, which is predominantly targeting the Jewish people because they are Jews. We have an example from the years of the Second World War, Germany and the countries allied to Germany, when millions and millions of Jewish people were killed simply because they were Jews. This was one of the ugliest forms of anti-Semitism. But I think we are coming with a clear message that simply being critical towards the Israeli government, towards their attitude, not only attitude, but the way they are treating Palestinian people, especially in Gaza and the West Bank. One is not anti-Semite because one criticizes Israel for this kind of behavior and attitude, for its war crimes. Being critical of Israel simply does not mean being an anti-Semite or expressing empathy towards the suffering of the Palestinian people. Cannot mean that one is anti-Semitic or anti-Semite.
It's very important that we see anti-Semitism as a form of racism toward Jews because they are Jews. Today, it's been weaponized. The new anti-Semitism, that's a phrase, the new anti-Semitism is generally understood to be the synthesis or the fusion of Israel with Judaism, so that criticism of Israel as a Jewish state is increasingly being identified with anti-Semitism. Zionists will say Israel is a Jewish state, therefore if you criticize Israel, you're criticizing the Jews. We're going to unpack this clearly in our conversation, but the term anti-Semitism has been weaponized to silence criticism of Israel. It's as simple as that. Israel likes to portray itself as the democracy, the only democracy in the Middle East, with the most moral army in the world, a movement to provide a safe haven for Jewish people who've suffered persecution around the world. And therefore they see Israel as enshrining the embodiment of Jewishness or Judaism. The problem there is that when you start to treat Israel differently from other states, other nations, then you are elevating Israel to a special status, to give it immunity from criticism. That's why Zionists particularly have accused its critics of being anti-Semitic and a way to silence them or shame them into silence. Anti-Semitism is racism toward Jews because they are Jews. It's to do with caricaturing them, blaming them for ills in society and so on. But it's no different from prejudice toward blacks because they're blacks, or Muslims because they're Muslims. It's a way in which a society that, or a people group that deem themselves under threat, will express racism or prejudice or hatred toward another group that's a minority that is deemed as a threat to their existence.
It seems that until recently, most of us had a pretty good picture of what anti-Semitism was and what it wasn't. I can say it for myself. I was probably never consciously been thinking about trying to define it, but I plainly knew that anti-Semitism always happens there when people are hating the Jewish people just simply because they're Jews. But we have come now to the point when basically anything can be labeled as anti-Semitism, if it in any form represents a criticism of the current government of Israel, its prime minister, and the way it behaves towards the Palestinian people. Even if you are expressing empathy towards Palestinian people, even if you are saying it is not all right to subject Palestinian people to this kind of almost year and a half of tortures and killings and war crimes and genocide, this is being labeled as anti-Semitism, serious cases of anti-Semitism. But it cannot be so. For example, it cannot be that when Prime Minister Netanyahu accuses from the pulpit of the United Nations practically the entire world for being anti-Semitic, this cannot be so simply because many countries, many people in the world do not agree with what Israel is doing right now. Or, for example, now what happened just a day or two ago, when the US Congress threatened ICC, International Criminal Court, with sanctions over Israel arrest warrants. Basically, it has declared the ICC being an anti-Semitic entity. But this cannot be so. How did we get here?
It's been a gradual change in people's perception of Israel. From the 1940s and 50s, Israel was seen as a democracy, a place of refuge for Jewish people around the world, creating a land flowing of milk and honey. But increasingly, people began to appreciate, particularly within the Arab world, that Israel was practicing a form of supremacism, of apartheid, segregation, the kind of segregation we saw in South Africa, segregation we've seen in the States. With the end of slavery, segregation became a dominant manifestation of that desire of supremacism, white supremacism. And as that has been increasingly been manifested in Israel through expelling Palestinians from their land, building exclusive Jews-only settlements in the occupied territories, holding Palestinians under military rule, having two separate healthcare systems, two separate legal systems. For example, Jews living in the occupied territory come under Israeli civil law. Palestinians living next to them come under Israeli military law. Very different legal systems depending on your nationality. It's apartheid. And as Israel has been increasingly criticized for that policy of apartheid and supremacism, which has only been achievable through the use of force and violence, and especially since October 2023, when we've seen the invasion, the genocide, the ethnic cleansing in Gaza, and increasingly now on the West Bank, people are waking up to the reality of what Israel is doing. And because of that, Israel has got to push back. And the way they've pushed back is to accuse more and more people, leaders, for example, of being anti-Semitic. So Jeremy Corbyn, for example, in the Labour Party, religious leaders, political leaders, academics who stood out for international law, human rights, are being increasingly accused of anti-Semitism. And the way they're doing this is that they are using a definition of anti-Semitism called the IHRA working definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition. It was developed in about 10, 15 years ago as a working definition, as a work in progress, as a document that could be discussed, refined, but it was never intended to have a legal status. It was never intended that it would be used to define acts that would be deemed illegal. And in fact, the IHRA is not a definition. By definition, a definition has to be definite. And in the very first sentence of the IHRA working definition, it says anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. By adding that word may to the very first sentence of the definition, it becomes indefinite because you're having to use something else to define whether it is or is not anti-Semitism. So it's not a definition. And when they incorporate the fact that anti-Semitism can be against non-Jews, then it loses all common sense. You know, anti-Semitism is prejudice toward Jews. If it's prejudice toward blacks, it's not anti-Semitism. If it's directed toward Muslims, it's Islamophobia. It's not anti-Semitism. So the definition was never intended to be used as a legal framework, but it has been exploited by Zionists intentionally to rub out the clear lines, the legal definition lines, to make it fuzzy, to make it like you're walking into a fog. You know, when you're driving into fog, you slow down, you put your lights on, you are careful. And that's what they've done. They've rubbed out the lines. They've made the definition fuzzy so that it's more to do with feelings than objectivity. So, for example, increasingly it's being used to criticize people because Jewish people feel offended or are upset by statements being made critical of Israel. And that is not anti-Semitism. It's not prejudice toward Jews. It's criticism of the policies of a state. But that's how it's being increasingly used to shut down debate, to silence criticism, and to demonize individuals deemed as a threat to the ongoing Zionist agenda.
Can we then say that anti-Semitism has been today weaponized to the point of being stripped of its intended meaning, to the point that it has actually become meaningless?
Very much so. And that's the worry, that by redefining anti-Semitism, diluting the definition to mean virtually anything, it is tragically exacerbating instances of anti-Semitism. When Israel demands that it be defined as the Jewish collective, meaning all Jews are citizens of Israel, Israel is synonymous with being Jewish, the actions of the state of Israel are associated with Jewish people, rightly or wrongly, and that is leading to increased acts of anti-Semitism, a prejudice toward Jews. So ironically, the dilution of the definition and Israel's actions in Gaza particularly are leading to a greater number of instances of anti-Semitism. Anthony Lerman, I quoted earlier, said this recently. He said, the decoupling of the understanding of anti-Semitism from traditional anti-Semitic tropes, which thereby made criticism of Israel in and of itself anti-Semitic, necessarily made the opposite, i.e., support for Israel, into the touchstone for expressing sympathy with Jews. It becomes synonymous. And he says this has opened the door for the phenomenon of Jewish support for far-right, anti-Islam, anti-immigrant parties keen to whitewash their pasts and sanitize their anti-Muslim prejudice by expressing support for Israel. And this is the irony that several of the Eastern European states and West European political parties that are far right and would be deemed as racist are being nurtured and developing relationships with the government of Israel. It's a win-win for both sides. So it's ironic that Zionism is exacerbating anti-Semitism.
Let us stop here for a moment. Are you saying that the manifestations of this meaningless form or forms of anti-Semitism, which is being attached to anything and everything, is hurting not only people who are actually standing up to the war crimes and genocide and in general the attitude and behavior of Israel at this time, but that it is actually hurting the Jewish people too, including the State of Israel?
Again, Brian Klug, K-L-U-G, is another academic who's been highly critical of the IHRA working definition. He said, when anti-Semitism is everywhere, it is nowhere. When every anti-Zionist is an anti-Semite, we no longer know how to recognize the real thing. The concept of anti-Semitism loses its significance. And tragically, what we're seeing as a result of the genocide and ethnic cleansing in Gaza is that Israel is draining the word of its meaning. It's draining the word of its meaning, which can only lead tragically to a greater instances of hatred wrongly of Jews because they are the assumption is that they are associated with Israel. So ironically, Zionism is the enemy of the Jews. Zionism is not synonymous with Judaism or Jewishness. We've got to keep emphasizing that and working with our Jewish friends, our anti-Zionist friends particularly, to make it crystal clear that anti-Semitism is racism. We repudiate that, but we will not be intimidated or silenced from speaking out on human rights issues, irrespective of who is being targeted or persecuted. But in this case, Israel is is responsible for what we're seeing in Gaza and the West Bank today.
I'm sure that in your long history of activism in unmasking the evils of Zionism, you must have come across when some people, some leaders have been wrongfully accused of anti-Semitism, when actually anti-Semitism was weaponized against them for supposedly doing something that they didn't do, and they labeled them as anti-Semites. Could you give us an example or two?
Jeremy Corbyn, for example, who was a left-wing Labour MP. He supported me when I was accused wrongly of anti-Semitism 10, 12 years ago. When he was elected leader of the Labour Party, suddenly anti-Semitism became a big issue within the Labour Party. Allegations of anti-Semitism were rife. It was whipped up by the Zionist lobby because he was the first political leader in Europe who had declared that it was intention to recognize the state of Palestine. Ben White is a journalist here in the UK, and he said this: the Labour Party has more than 400 MPs and peers at Westminster, in addition to 7,000 local government officials and 390,000 members. The anti-Semitism crisis has involved 6 individuals, most of whom had never held or no longer hold elected office. Jeremy Corbyn himself has repeatedly condemned anti-Semitism since becoming leader, while according to the party General Secretary Ian Nicol, everyone reported for anti-Semitism has been suspended or excluded. And the irony is that in a government survey in 2018, it found that Conservative supporters were more likely to hold racist views than Labour supporters. And suddenly, when Jeremy Corbyn was defeated and Keir Starmer was elected as leader of the Labour Party, suddenly anti-Semitism disappears. It was used to destroy a political leader, and it's no longer an issue because he's gone. I'll give you another example. A colleague of mine, David Miller, is an academic from Bristol University in England, and he was an outspoken advocate of human rights in Palestine. One student, a Jewish student, who was not even one of his students, made a complaint about a sentence he used in a lecture criticizing Israel for its policies. That led to the university suspending David Miller and in the end sacking David Miller. He went to an employment tribunal. The tribunal said he was unfairly dismissed and is entitled to compensation, but his academic career is over. The guilt by association, the smear, if you like, is sufficient to cause the university to revoke his employment. You know, it was, as I said, it wasn't even one of his own students. It was just another student in the university who was offended by something he said. Two examples, political leaders. And again, I think the strategy is if they can target one political leader, other political leaders will keep their heads down. Target one academic, other academics will keep their heads down.
Why is it that we cannot be silent about the sins and evils of manipulation when it comes to what anti-Semitism is and what it is not?
We must work out and live out and be consistent with our convictions. And if we feel that a group is being marginalized, prejudiced, targeted, demonized, we must speak out and say, this is wrong. This is not acceptable, and work peacefully but tenaciously to expose racism wherever it manifests itself, irrespective of who it is. That's why I do not distinguish between anti-Semitism and anti-racism, anti-Islamophobia or Christophobia. Christians are persecuted in many countries, China and many other countries. And we must advocate for those being persecuted, whoever they are. So anti-Semitism is a form of racism, and we must repudiate it unequivocally. But it does not justify silence when we see Israel committing genocide in Gaza, for example. It does not give Israel a pass, and if we remain silent, we are complicit. You know, I saw a poster recently that said, if you ever wondered what you would have done during the Holocaust, you're doing it now. And if we are silent on Gaza, we would have been silent when the Holocaust took place. If we speak out now, it gives us confidence we would have spoken out then, even at the risk to our own lives.
In our previous program, we have focused predominantly on Christian Zionism and dispensationalism and how all of this is related, and also anti-Semitism. But we cannot escape talking at least a little bit about Christian Zionism and contribution of Christians, and I would say some Christians, to actually this confusion when it comes to what anti-Semitism is and what anti-Semitism is not. I myself heard enough to know that so often Christians who are very much in love with a modern day Israel, who see a prophetic eschatological role in a geographical Israel of today that was born in 1948 and beyond, labeling other Christians who do not agree with them as being anti-Semitic. There is no question that somewhere there is some wrong theology playing a significant role. Why is that so? Could you try to explain?
And turn a blind eye when they see Israel committing genocide, but will speak out against Russia in the Ukraine, or declare that genocide is taking place in Sudan, but it's not taking place in Gaza. I've spent much of my life examining Christian Zionism and why Christians in the past and in many senses today support the state of Israel. And I wrote 2 books on the subject, Zion's Christian Soldiers and Christian Zionism Roadmap to Armageddon. To answer your question, I would basically say that if Christians support what Israel is doing today, it reflects a very shallow, immature Christian faith. Christian Zionism is an oxymoron. You can be a Christian or a Zionist, but you can't be both. It's like saying I'm a Christian racist. Yes, Christians did defend apartheid in South Africa. They pulled out a few verses from the Old Testament to justify the segregation of the races, but it led to supremacism, it led to exploitation, it led to the theft of land and subjugation of the indigenous people. It has done the same in every colonial enterprise around the world, where white Europeans or white Americans have colonized and subjugated, appropriated raw materials, resources from the indigenous peoples and taken over their land. Israel is no different. But for Christians to justify this action of Israel is deeply, deeply troubling. It demonstrates that they have very little understanding of the scriptures, of the Christian faith. They're clearly not following in the footsteps of Jesus. How do we understand it? How do we explain it? Well, they're basically making a number of fundamental mistakes. They are equating Israel and the Jewish people in the Bible, in the Old Testament, with racial definitions rather than spiritual. What I mean by that is they assume Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 tribes were ethnically pure all the way through the Old Testament. They are the Jews, they are Israel. And today, Israel, the people of Israel, are the direct descendants of those 12 tribes. That is not taught in the Bible. The people of God, Israel, the Jewish people in the Hebrew scriptures, were made up of many nationalities, made up of many races. The Bible says that. Esther 8 verse 17 says, and many people of other nationalities became Jews. Now, if many people of other nationalities became Jews, the term Jew was no longer synonymous with tracing your family tree back to one of the 12 tribes of Israel. So it's no different from the New Testament, where the people of God is made up of many nationalities. Your identification with God and being a member of the people of God is on the basis of faith, not race. So that's one of the fundamental errors which Christian Zionists make. They associate Israel today with Israel in the Old Testament, and they associate Israel of the Bible with ethnic identification, and that's not taught in the Bible. What they do as a consequence of that is they idolize Israel today. They put Israel on a pedestal. They are God's chosen people, and therefore we treat them differently from other nationalities, other peoples. They elevate Israel and they demonize the Palestinians. The Palestinians are the Philistines. The Philistines were the enemies of the Jews. Therefore, that conflict is continuing today. The danger with idolizing people is that you romanticize them and it blurs one's ethical values and the way one views other people. So it's a shallow theology, and it's a dangerous theology as well. Christian Zionism is associated with a very apocalyptic, pessimistic, confrontational view of the future. It's synonymous with what we would call Armageddon theology. The idea there's going to be a final battle, and if we're on God's side, we'll be on Israel's side, and those countries that oppose Israel today are on Satan's side. And this final battle will take place in the Middle East. And again, what it does is it leads to a very dualistic view of the world, the good guys and the bad guys. And with God on our side, we can justify our behavior, and we can demonize and punish and ethnically cleanse those deemed to be the enemy. I'll give you one example. In the media today, they were publicizing the fact that the Israeli authorities have rejected the allegations made after October the 7th, 2023, when it was alleged that people in Gaza, the men in Gaza, were breaking out and raping Israeli women. You know, it was part of the propaganda to justify the destruction of Gaza. That story has been repudiated now, but you think, well, it's a bit late. It's just one example of the kind of story that was used to justify the killing of Palestinians. It deflects attention. It's also linked to a theology called the prosperity gospel. The idea that God will bless people materially if they bless Israel. It goes back to a promise God made to Abraham: I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. All nations on earth will be blessed through you. But it was a promise made to Abraham, not to Israel, not to the Jewish people, and certainly not to Israel today. The promises God made to Abraham, we know from the Bible, were fulfilled in Jesus, not in Israel. They are fulfilled in Jesus and those who recognize Jesus as the Messiah. But that's how evangelicals particularly justify their support for Israel. It's based on a shallow theology and a misunderstanding of Scripture and an idolizing of Israel today.
It seems that in some way the shallow, misguided theology of Zionism, and the Christian Zionism in particular, has led some people, some centers of power, in giving you a hard time too. You have been falsely accused of anti-Semitism by some Zionist lobby groups that have for years worked very hard trying to discredit you, even with the leadership of your own church denomination, which you faithfully served for many years. Would you like to share your experience with us?
I've shared with you about what happened to Jeremy Corbyn as a political leader, David Miller as an academic. My journey has been very similar. My interest in the subject as a young Christian came about because I wanted to find out more about the land where Jesus lived and worked, the Holy Land, Israel, Palestine. And I was raised on a Christian Zionist theology as a young Christian. And that gave me a motivation to unpack that theology and visit the land. And there I saw the reality of apartheid. I saw the reality of the oppression of the Palestinians and the irony that the Christian church typically supported Israel and not the Christians in Palestine. They supported a secular state against their brothers and sisters in Palestine. And that deeply troubled me. And that's why I did my PhD examining Christian Zionism and began to unpack the theology of Christian Zionism in my second book, Zionist Christian Soldiers. And it was because I was challenging if you like, the superficial nature of Christian Zionism, its unbiblical nature, its racist theology, that I came, if you like, onto the radar of Christian Zionists, particularly Messianic Jews, a small group of Messianic Jews who clearly felt threatened, who felt exposed, that I'd taken their baby away from them. I'd cut the umbilical cord between the Bible and Zionism. And they began to target me about 18 years ago. They set up a website called Seismic Shock. It was meant to play on my name, Sizer, seismic, earthquake, shock. Anonymous articles written about me alleging that I associated with the Holocaust deniers, with anti-Semites. The police got involved. They supported me. They identified one of the individuals who was responsible for this nasty stuff. And ironically, in the end, he apologized. I have a letter from him explaining that he recognized what he was doing was wrong and wanted my forgiveness. But this group persisted in targeting me, making complaints to the Church of England. And in the end, it led to a tribunal. Took 4 years. And in the end, the Church of England, 4 individuals representing the Church of England who did not know me, who were appointed to investigate the allegations. The investigation examined 12 instances where I was accused of anti-Semitism. 11 of the 12 were dismissed. The one that was deemed an example of anti-Semitic behavior was the fact that I had posted on Facebook an article about 9/11 and the allegation that Israel was complicit in some way. It was on my website for 4 days. I put it on my Facebook, I put it up there for debate. I did not indicate I agreed with the article, disagree with it. I was inviting debate, as we often do on social media. I found this article, what do you think? But it was deemed anti-Semitic. It had actually been raised 4 years earlier, and I'd apologized, taken it down, apologized, and it was accepted. The apology was accepted, but it was resurrected for this tribunal that took place about 6 or 7 years after. And it was deemed as evidence of anti-Semitism. And as a result of that, I'd already retired, so I was not employed by the Church of England, but they took away my right to take services in Anglican churches as a retired priest. Not exactly something that I would want to do anyway in my retirement, but it was the most that they could do. Ironically, they didn't provide a single sentence of mine from all of my sermons, all of my articles. They couldn't find a single sentence that they deemed anti-Semitic. Nothing I'd ever said, nothing I'd ever written. And they didn't present a single witness accusing me of anti-Semitism. Not a single witness and not a single sentence. On my side, I had over 50 academics, bishops, clergy, rabbis, imams, politicians defending me, repudiating the allegations. Most of those who came and gave eyewitness testimony were Jews who supported me, but their testimony was not taken seriously, was not accepted. And the irony is that as the tribunal was being put in motion, we insisted, my side insisted, I insisted that anti-Semitism be defined. The Board of Deputies who brought the complaint against me said it wasn't necessary. See, again, they wanted to keep it fuzzy, cloudy, ambiguous. I said, no, it's got to be defined. And the tribunal agreed that we would have to have a definition, and could we agree on an expert witness who would define anti-Semitism for us? And we proposed the author of the IHRA working definition, they rejected him because they knew that he repudiated its use as a legal definition. Isn't it ironic that they were using the IHRA definition, but they wouldn't allow the author, the originator, to speak and define anti-Semitism because they knew he would not agree with them. So we ended up with one expert witness each. I had Anthony Lerman, who's a leading international expert on anti-Semitism. They chose a bishop who, under cross-examination, admitted he wasn't an expert on anti-Semitism. So it was a charade in terms of the process that was undertaken. And at the end of the day, the expert witness on anti-Semitism, Anthony Lerman, he was appalled at the outcome of the tribunal. He said this disgraceful miscarriage of justice against someone who has never uttered a word of hate against Jews will be a permanent stain on the Church of England and Board of Deputies. And my barrister, a leading legal expert who represented me, said it is significant that not one word or statement from Dr. Sizer has been shown to be anti-Semitic. There are none. So it's a classic example, I was a classic example, if you like, of the use of an ambiguous, indefinite definition. The IHRA working definition was used against me without witnesses, without clear definition, about a post I put on for 4 days that I hadn't necessarily agreed with. That was sufficient basis to silence me. I don't take it personally. My observation is that the strategy used against Jeremy Corbyn, against David Miller, against myself, and many, many others follows a very clear pattern. First, it's intimidate. They will intimidate you by phone calls, by emails, by articles about you, criticizing you, and the objective is to shut you up. Put your head down under the wall and stop talking about Israel. If intimidation doesn't work, they move to the second level of their strategy, which is to isolate you. It's like if you've got an infectious disease, you are isolated to stop you infecting other people. And they do the same with your views. They see your views as infectious. If they can't intimidate you, they will intimidate others to isolate you. So you'll be invited to speak at a conference. They'll target the conference organizers to have you disinvited. Your PhD has been accepted by the university. They'll target the university to have your PhD revoked. That's the strategy they use. Intimidate, isolate, and if they can't isolate you, they go to the third level, which is incriminate. They'll try and use the law against you. They will accuse you of Holocaust denial, associating with terrorists, sympathy for terrorists, or anti-Semitism. So it's intimidate, isolate, incriminate. And where none of those three work, they move to the fourth level, which is to liquidate. I couldn't find another I, but liquidate will do, or assassinate. And in the last year, we have seen how Israel has assassinated political leaders, military leaders, medics, scientists, anyone they deem as a threat to the Zionist agenda. So it's a fourfold strategy: intimidate, isolate, incriminate, liquidate. That's the strategy they use. And that's why we must be aware of how threatened they must be to go to such lengths to silence criticism of Israel.
Reverend Stephen Sizer, thank you very much for being so vulnerable with us. I find your story, I find your testimony very encouraging. There are scary bits there, but I do find your message and your story encouraging. And I'm sure that many who are listening and to us and watching this program share my opinion about this. So I would like to ask you now directly to give us an advice. What shall we do when we are being gaslighted or accused of anti-Semitism, when we disagree with the ongoing genocide and war crimes committed by Israel, and when we empathize with the suffering of the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank, and the tragedy doesn't actually end only there? How do we stay strong? How do we stay focused? How do we stay unafraid? How do we not let ourselves be intimidated? How do we remain proactive in our commitment to justice, which has really not been forthcoming over the past year and a half, for sure, neither from Israel, neither from the United States of America, neither from Britain, and neither in any meaningful way from the institutions of power in the West. What would be your advice?
I think there are 5 ways I believe we can constructively, proactively respond both to anti-Semitism and what we see happening in Palestine, but in other countries as well, where genocide is occurring, where prejudice, racism, hostility is a dominant factor. The first, most important, is we must repudiate all forms of racism, unequivocally, including anti-Semitism. No exceptions. We must secondly repudiate the small minority of anti-Semites using the Palestinian cause for their own agenda. There are a few, but not many. Thirdly, we should cooperate with Jewish organizations committed to both repudiating anti-Semitism and repudiating Zionism. For example, Jewish Voice for Peace, JVP, Jews for Justice for Palestinians, JFJFP, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, that's ICAD. Natura Carta is an Orthodox Jewish anti-Zionist movement. The Women in Black. There are many Jewish organizations that are repudiating both anti-Semitism and Zionism, and we need to work hand in hand with them. We must remain determined to hold Israel accountable to international law for its racist, genocidal policies toward Palestinians. And the best way to do that is to engage in BDS, boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. Sanctions we have to leave to governments. But if we sanction Russia for its actions in Ukraine, we must sanction Israel for its actions in Gaza. We as individuals can boycott Israeli goods, boycott goods that are produced by Western companies that are the profits go to the settlements or the products are sold in the settlements. Divestment. If we have access to investment funds, make sure that they are not being used to make profits. Those investments are not invested in companies that are profiting from the occupation. Weapons companies, for example. So remain determined to hold Israel accountable. Support the ICJ and the ICC, the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice investigating genocide in Gaza, investigating war crimes by Israeli military and political leaders. And then finally, continue to draw parallels between Zionist settler colonialism with the treatment of Native Americans in the United States, with blacks in South Africa, Aborigines in Australia, for example. Wherever indigenous peoples have been persecuted, demonized, marginalized, suppressed, oppressed, or exterminated, we must continue to speak out against such injustice, but also draw parallels with what Israel is doing in the occupied Palestinian territories, and especially in Gaza. Those are 5 ways we can repudiate anti-Semitism, but also speak out and stand up against what's happening in Palestine today.
Reverend Stephen Sizer, thank you very much. You have left us with much to think about. It is a challenging interview, but we need to know. We need to know. We need to be able to think clearly about the circumstances, state of affairs of the days we live in. I would definitely like to host you again and to take part in another conversation with you, either related to the topic we have shared today and previously, or maybe something completely new. So we will stay in touch. And my friends, thank you for following us and being with us. And I would really like to encourage you to spread the word. Make this channel known within the circle of your friends. Start by basically doing a very simple thing, by liking us and by subscribing to this channel, and also spreading the word in the circle of your friends. Let them know we are here and we are leading here some serious conversations from the platform of faith, addressing the issues of the days and times we live in. And I'm displaying right now again a picture of Reverend Stephen Sizer with his 2 books, which I would like to encourage you to look for those books. Thank you, Reverend Sizer, again. Thank you, all of you, my friends, for watching with us. Spread the word. And we will be, God willing, meeting again very soon. Until then, I wish you all the best, and may God bless you in every way. And stay strong.
First, it's intimidate. They will intimidate you by phone calls, by emails, by articles about you, criticizing you, and the objective is to shut you up. Put your head down under the wall and stop talking about Israel. If intimidation doesn't work, they move to the second level of their strategy, which is to isolate you. If they can't intimidate you, they will intimidate others to isolate you. So you'll be invited to speak at a conference. They'll target the conference organizers to have you disinvited. Your PhD has been accepted by the university. They'll target the university to have your PhD revoked. They can't isolate you. They go to the third level, which is incriminate. They'll try and use the law against you.